running a little bit late. All right. So thank you all for coming to this. This is the first of our Lunch and Learn series regarding exploring results that we learned from the Grand Valley's participation in the 2016 National Survey of Student Engagement. Today's topic is students' experience with diversity. And guiding you today, you have me. I'm Philip Batty, the Director of Institutional Analysis. I'll be guiding you through the data initially, and my hope is that that won't take too long to walk you through what we have to talk about, and then we can move right on to discussing it in an open forum. In addition, we have Dr. Jessie Bernal, the Vice President for Inclusion and Equity, with us, and I think Jessie's role with us today is going to be listen to what people have to say, and then maybe help us frame the conversation as needed in terms of what our current practices and current plans are. So I have a few announcements regarding the internet streaming that we are doing today. First of all, welcome to anybody who's joined us online. I hope that you noticed as you logged in that there is a handout document. People here in the room have it in hand to work through, and you may find it helpful to have a print copy or an accessible copy to work with so that you can see the data when I don't have it thrown up on the screen for you. We do want to encourage you to please submit any comments or questions via the chat feature on the YouTube page. We have Becky Beechler here in the room to help us inject any of that input we get from our online participants into whatever conversation we have going on in the room. That said, I'm told we should expect maybe a 30 or 40-second delay with the streaming, so that may give us a little bit of a challenge in terms of including those online participants in any kind of a real live give and take with people in the room, but we absolutely are going to do our best to get your input into the conversation as well as we can. So the first step I want to do is I want to briefly introduce NSSE, and then I want to walk us through the data, or at least how to read the data that's presented in the handout document. And I do really want to get through that piece of it that is me standing up here at the podium relatively quickly. So I hope that maybe we can withhold the majority of questions until we can get to that discussion period, at which point I'm eager to hear anything you have to say or any questions you have. But to dive right into the introduction then, what we're here to talk about is the National Survey of Student Engagement. And NSSE is a widely respected national survey, and it's built on the premise that even though it's very hard to study learning outcomes on the kind of scope and scale that it would take to evaluate the effectiveness of higher education, it's actually possible and even kind of easy to instead measure the level of engagement and participation in effective educational practices within educational environments, with the implication then that environments where students are more engaged in effective practices are presumed to result in more learning than environments with less engagement in those effective practices. So that's not how NSSE works. Grand Valley has participated in NSSE on a 3-year cycle over the last 10 years or so, and our most recent participation was in the winter-spring of 2016, and those are the results that we recently have back and are eager to explore today. NSSE is designed with a 2-tiered population, so students take it in their first year of college, so in the winter of their freshman year, and then they take it again as seniors. So sophomores and juniors don't participate, but because we have this early indication of engagement in these practices, and then again when they're seniors, it allows us to develop a picture of how students' engagement in these effective practices maybe builds or changes through the course of their higher education career. So NSSE is a very large survey. There's hundreds of questions that each student takes when they participate. And for all of those results, the findings then are disaggregated among the first-year students and among the senior students, and then among various comparison groups as well, with the upshot being that the documents of the results are copious. There are pages upon pages of results, many of which are available to all of you on the Institutional Analysis website to dig into at your leisure. But when it comes down to maybe a one-page at-a-glance summary of NSSE results, what I have on the screen here is almost the best we can do. And so this is the summary of peer comparisons for the engagement indicators in NSSE. And engagement indicators are multi-item scales that summarize students' participation in various categories of the effective practices. So for example, the first one, I hope you can see it on the screen, is called higher order learning. And that is just a summary of various items that measure the extent to which students' coursework is asking them to engage in higher level cognitive processes, as in Bloom's taxonomy, as opposed to lower. So are they applying knowledge, are they integrating knowledge, or are they mostly reading and memorizing? So for the average of those questions then, Grand Valley will have a summary score of the average of all of the first-year students' responses for those kinds of questions to give them an idea of, to give them a central tendency of where their freshmen are. And that average can be compared to the average that we see among different peer groups. And in this case, we have 3 different peer groups. Oops, wrong direction. Hope that's a little easier to see. So the first peer group then is all public universities in the Great Lakes region. And the second peer group is all public universities that share the same Carnegie classification as us, master's large institutions, basically schools that have a significant graduate presence, but not an extensive investment in doctoral education. And then the final peer group is NSSE participants who are also on Grand Valley's short list of identified peer institutions. So mostly what you need to know about the 3 peer groups is that there are 3 different but overlapping groups of public universities that are to some degree similar to Grand Valley. And we're going to use those to sort of benchmark where our results put us in the grander scheme of things. So in the report that you're looking at, the bottom line is blue triangles are good news and red triangles are bad news. And it's gratifying for us that the blue triangles outnumber the red ones pretty significantly. That's, validates a lot of the hard work that we do, but also we still need to dig in and try to figure out, in the case of the blue triangles, what it is that we're doing well, or in other cases, what it is we do less well. If we focus in for a minute on the results from our seniors, we can see there's a lot of good news here, a lot of blue triangles. But if you look specifically at, there's one engagement indicator here, discussions with diverse others, where regardless of which peer group you choose, Grand Valley seniors' average responses on this scale are significantly lower than those in our peer groups. So that's the group that we want to dig into a little bit today and discuss the details. So we can turn to the first page of the of the handout that I gave you, which is the detailed information that contributes to that discussions with diverse others scale. And since the information that really caught our attention was what we found among the seniors, I'm going to focus in on what we can say about the seniors. So, one thing we can see is the scale itself is the average response from our seniors to these 4 questions. Essentially, during the last year, how often have you had discussions with people of different racial or ethnic background from you, or different economic background from you, different religious beliefs, or different political beliefs? So I want to dig in a little bit to what we can read here on the line 8A, again among the seniors, just to make sure that we're all on the same page in terms of interpreting these results on the report. So we had 755 of our seniors who answered this question, and this is their distribution of responses here. So 37% of them said sometimes, 27% said often. This big red 2.8 is the average response for our seniors. So if you weight these responses according to this numeric scale and then compute an average, you get to 2.8. And to interpret that, you'd say, well, that's, between 2 equals sometimes and 3 equals often, and a little closer to often. So when we look then at one of our peer groups, and we'll start with this first one, which is universities in the Great Lakes region, we can see that the average response among seniors in this larger group is 3.1. So going back again, that'll correspond to a little bit on the high side of often. And we see the red triangle right below, which indicates that Grand Valley's average for that question is statistically significantly lower than the average for the peer grouping. That's also what these 3 asterisks are supposed to indicate. If you look just to the right of that, you can see a number -0.28. That's the effect size. And effect size is just a measure of the size of a difference, sort of independent of statistical significance. What we need to bear in mind for practical purposes of interpreting this report is an effect size of 0.2 or bigger in absolute value, so -0.2 or smaller, is a pretty big effect size, larger than what you're likely to find in the majority of these reports. So you can see some down below where the difference is statistically significant, and you see an effect size a little smaller than 0.2. Again, those are statistically meaningful results, but they stand out a little less for us than the ones with the larger effect size. So to move on then, for the 3 peer groups, no matter which of the peer groups you choose on this one item, 8A, you can see that our mean is statistically significantly below the average for the peers, and the effect size is a pretty similar in the neighborhood of 0.3, which is really quite a large effect. So our students are saying that on average they interact less with people who are of a racial or ethnic background different than their own. Backing up a little more, you can see then that when NSSE says on average our students have lower discussions with diverse others, they're combining these results that say our students interact less with people from different race and ethnicity. They also interact less with people from different economic backgrounds and less with people from different religious beliefs. So certainly the one with the largest gaps is the race and ethnicity one, but actually across all 3 of these categories, our students are reporting less interaction. And if we skip back up to the freshman results for just a moment, you'll see that even though across categories of diversity our students were about average in terms of, our first year students were about average in terms of interacting with others, When it comes to interacting with people from a different racial or ethnic background, again, our students are reporting significantly less of that interaction than students at any of the peer groupings. So that's the information that has caught our attention. Now, it's definitely possible that the reason our students are saying that they interact less with diverse others, as it's called, is because there are fewer diverse others at Grand Valley with whom they can interact. So we take a look at that in page 2 of your handout. Of the 4 categories of diversity that the students were asked about, there are only 2 for which I have comparison information about the participants in the peer groups. And that is, and we only have 2 if you will accept the premise that a first-generation status is an okay proxy for socioeconomic status. Accepting that premise, then we can say the top graph is an indicator of economic diversity among the student bodies, and the bottom graph is a measure of racial and ethnic diversity among the participants. And looking at that, in both cases, we can see that Grand Valley's participants are significantly less diverse on these measures than the members of the comparison groups. It's particularly pronounced in the lower graph in terms of racial and ethnic diversity of the participation. So, we absolutely could make a reasonably strong argument that says, well, the reason our students say that they are interacting less with these diverse others is because they simply have less exposure to diverse others. And that pretty clearly seems to be part of the explanation, at least. The question for us, and what I hope we can get on to discussing very soon, is whether that's a sufficient discussion of the matter. Do we just let ourselves off the hook based on knowledge that, well, these are the students we have, these are the cards we're dealt, or in what ways do we want to continue to discuss what the next steps are in terms of addressing this situation? So I really am eager to get to that discussion. So I want to very briefly mention the 3rd page of your handout. I don't plan to walk through it or talk about it in any detail because the layout and the interpretation are exactly the same as the 1st page that I showed you. But what this is NSSE items that our students completed that are clearly related to these issues of interactions with people of diverse backgrounds. But these are items that don't contribute to that discussions with diverse others scale. So I hope you can look at those. I hope the findings in them will make sense to you and that maybe they can contribute to your understanding and to any discussion we can get into about it. But I don't want to dwell on what they say because I do want to open up the floor and begin having a discussion of what we think all of this means. So I would be happy to just have an open discussion, but to the extent that I need to seed the discussion, I would say the questions we might want to answer about this, the first question is, do we think these data are meaningful? So sometimes with survey data, there are aspects of the survey that cause the result not to mean what people would purport them to mean. If we have those kinds of issues with the NSSE data, we should air those out because it's certainly pertinent to the discussion. If we do think the data are meaningful, then the next question is, are they important? So some of these findings, maybe there are differences and maybe they are differences that we are not ready to address at this stage. Okay, let's discuss it. To the extent that the findings are important, I hope that we can move on to discussing what we think we should do about it. I'm sorry, what's the question about the question is, what about our respondents?
Are the 755 or so that Laura's responded, are they representative
It is tested. The respondents tend to be they tend to be less likely to be students of color. They tend to be more likely to be female. There's some differences in academic colleges, likelihood of responding. And that's part of the nature of survey data like this is there's response bias. We got responses, I believe, from 29% of invitees for this NSSE, which clearly isn't everybody. That's higher than the typical response rate nationwide, but lower than what we've had in previous iterations. And that's certainly one of the questions when it comes to interpreting data like this is, do you think the responses are representative, or at least are similarly representative to that in the peer groups? Yes, for survey data, 29% is doing pretty well. Thank you. And yeah, for our online attendees, the comment was that it would not be surprising to see that the opportunities to interact with diverse others might vary pretty significantly by academic program. And that's something that we've seen and we are exploring a little bit. We have broken down our NSSE results by academic college and made an effort to distribute those to the colleges and to encourage them to dig in and interpret results in much the same way we're doing here today. Yes, thanks.
So this survey is sent out every year to freshmen, every year?
We do it every 3 years. So we last did it in 2013, and we did it again this past academic year, and we'll do it again in 2019. And so at the same time we do it among our freshmen, we do it among the seniors. So it's not strictly a longitudinal design where the same people who took it as freshmen in 2013 would take it as seniors in 2016. There is some overlap, but it's not designed to be specifically longitudinal follow-up.
I know we sort of had a conversation about the implications of the diversity of the student body and whether that makes a difference. And I think research tells us it does in a lot of cases. The questions that I would have that we need to consider as a university is what is that sort of threshold? Because we're more diverse. I was looking at, you added the 2013 data, and we haven't changed at all, even though we're more diverse today than we were in 2013, both in first gen as well as students of color. And so it's just a question, I guess, that we haven't met that threshold, if that is an argument of as part of the reason for this, I guess.
Right, and again to repeat, Dr. Bernal observes that even though that if we're going to say that the demographic background distribution of our students is critical to this issue of how much interaction we have among diverse groups, then it's maybe a little bit discouraging that even though the diversity of our students did increase since 2013, these measures of interaction among diverse students didn't increase at the same time. And we want to we have identified increasing the diversity of the student body as a goal of the university, and we want to try to discuss where we need to be and how we need to get there as part of this discussion as well as part of the larger university plan. Is that accurate enough, Jesse?
How about it?
So I'm looking at question 14 on that last page about how does your institution emphasize the following? And on your thing about what can we do about it, that's a pretty low thing. So the students are perceiving that we don't emphasize contact with diverse groups amongst the seniors, that 2.5 there, the bottom half. We're lower, tiny effect, not a big effect size, but that would seem to be the question, that if we could boost, the fact that that one's low troubles me, and the fact that something we could try to address.
I agree. Of the questions that are available to us here, that's the one question that strikes me as more or less independent of the composition of our student body. That is, if we're not as diverse, if our student body is not as diverse as we would like, that should not prevent us from having curricula that emphasize the viewpoints and work of diverse scholars and diverse populations. And as you say, that's an area where we didn't show up especially well among our seniors, and we didn't show evidence of growth in the past 3 years as we would have liked.
So, Philip, that was the concern that I was going to raise. I remember seeing the 2013 data. You said 13, right?
Right.
And the fact that there was, in fact, I believe students perceived slightly less interaction as seniors. Is that on here? Do you have that? So even if it's slightly less or the same, the question about what happens during their 4 years, and now I'm thinking about context. So we live in a community that is highly segregated. Our students don't necessarily come from Grand Rapids, but there are some implications around how students continue to feel segregated or not, like there are communal spaces to share. So I'm moving a little bit ahead to a potential programmatic piece, which is we sent a group last year to Intergroup Dialogue training, that this idea of a sustained place to be with other people, because what this suggests is a conversation, which isn't the same as standing in line next to someone, even the same as sitting in a class next to someone. So I'm just offering, in terms of how we think about bringing this to scale, that I think an intergroup dialogue program might have the ability to move this from a co-curricular standpoint if we can find a way to engage students broadly.
Absolutely. That sounds like, a productive activity towards a solution that doesn't purely rely on increasing the numbers.
Yeah, I was just going to say, to go off of Marlene's comment, that from a student services perspective, I am a little surprised, or there's opportunity, I guess, with the first-year students, because a lot of these questions are oftentimes the foundation of a first-year orientation program, or at least a foundation of it or an outcome of it. So I think that when we are reviewing programs like transitions, this is a good opportunity to include more of the diversity opportunities within that program. So,
Great.
I'm glad the two people who made the comments are in offices that are in charge of those programs, so go for it. Do we collect any other demographic information as opposed, in addition to first-gen status and race ethnicity in the NSSE?
Very little. I'd have to go back and revisit it, but for example, as I was looking for information to match the religious diversity question that was in there or the political diversity, there's nothing in there on that. Most of the demographic items that they ask for relate to student status. So, you know, how many hours have they earned? How many hours do they take in a semester? What's their major? Things like that. Grand Valley declined to ask the sexual orientation question that was optional this year. Certainly we can revisit whether that's something that we want to pursue the next time we go around this.
So Philip, I was thinking about the global initiative. Am I calling that the right thing? Came out of Padnos a couple years ago, university-wide look at curriculum and the globalization, thank you, task force, that work. So I'm trying to make meaning. On the second page, I think the questions that aren't direct but related are really interesting. Number 2 is about a student's own agency around including different perspectives. So I guess that speaks to me in terms of students coming in, like what skills do they have to even do that? And then the third question that you have, which is number 17, I mean, encouraging versus understanding something are so very different. And the classroom piece is the one consistent contact we know we have. There's a ton of potential in the co-curricular. But I'm just wondering what implications that has for what happens in the classroom. Because teaching understanding of diverse backgrounds, perspectives, et cetera, there's not a lot of places we can guarantee that happens except in that space. So what discussions might we have? You know, is this a discussion with faculty? I don't know if the globalization piece has made an impact because we've been doing that for like the last 3 years, I think. So those are just questions. You know, has that made any difference in terms of an increased exposure to and feeling of understanding of difference in the classroom? And if not, maybe why?
Sure, and that's a question that we want to discuss again in this context of, you know, are the data meaningful? Are they important? And what do we want to do about it? If we've identified this as important, and in this case, particularly within academic and student affairs, whether this is an item of importance to us, then we need to sit down and work on what that plan to address it looks like. And in my position, I have opinions about all of this, but not necessarily my opinion that matters, and certainly not my opinion that matters in terms of pushing forward implementation of something like you're talking about. But I do want the goal of this series and of any discussions that I can have about our NSSE results is to just make sure that I'm getting the results in front of the people who can then have that discussion. If the result of the discussion is we don't care or we don't think we can do anything about that at this time, well, at least they know the data were there and took that step.
Is the data also, is it confidential, or do you identify the student? So is there a comparison between the same student, first year to senior?
There is a potential for that. So each student is invited in an identified way. So we know the G number that attaches to each result. Certainly we don't release any data in that form, but one thing we can do is we can link the information that we have from NSSE to other information, either from previous NSSEs or from Grand Valley Student Information, in order to try to dig in and see. One of the things that we want to do is when we talk about environments where students are engaged in effective practices, that does not necessarily mean the entire university environment. There are sub-environments that we want to focus on, and that ability to link to limited other data can be really rich for us in terms of identifying the environments within the university where student engagement in these practices is particularly strong or not.
Yeah, and that was interesting to your point about intergroup dialogue, because if we knew the students who were participating in those kinds of programs and saw changes in some of these outcomes, it might be an investment that we make as opposed to sort of spreading widely. Yeah.
Sure, and that's an opportunity that we have moving forward as we try to react to what we're learning from 2016. It's also an opportunity that we have in evaluating existing activities. I mean, to the extent that you have a program that you feel should have had an impact on these measures or other NSSE measures, one thing we can do is investigate the possibility of looking for those kinds of differences being reflected here in these 2016 results.
You know, one of the questions that you had up there was whether this was it reliable? Is that what you said? I don't remember the question, but it's interesting, meaningful. Definitely meaningful. It's interesting that this question number 14 on the last page, how much does your institution emphasize encouraging contact among students from different backgrounds? So we asked a similar question. It's different, so I know it's not completely comparable, about individuals' thoughts on the university's commitment to diversity in the campus climate survey. And that response was like 93%. And so I know they're not the same question, but they're similar questions. So people believe we're committed to it, but we're not encouraging the contact. So it's just an interesting comparison between the data points that we do have in the information.
I agree, and that's a finding we've had from other surveys as well. We used to do a UCLA survey of new freshmen and the companion survey of faculty, and what we would pretty consistently see is we did not necessarily see tangible results from efforts to increase diversity or understanding of diversity, but we pretty consistently saw a perception among the respondents that GVSU values those things. That actually does not show up here, interestingly and somewhat disappointingly.
See, I would say when you're in a class where there's absolutely nobody, I mean, there's just no diversity in the room, it's not really like it comes into your conversation on, you know, some sort of calculations or whatever that you're doing that day. And so that in some cases it just may not lend itself well to the conversation, and those seniors in particular, you know, it's just not something that's at the forefront. So, I mean, I don't know, but I do know that there's a lot of conversations that you're having in class that it's just not going to easily lend itself, I would think.
I agree, although I think to the extent that we identify this as a GVSU value, that we can provide motivation and training for faculty members or other facilitators to encourage that kind of thinking, to encourage the incorporation of diverse outlooks, even when the particular participant group is not that diverse.
I helped out with the coding of the open-ended responses to the last climate survey, not the most recent climate survey, the one preceding it. And one of the things that I was intrigued by, I spent one long afternoon working on a portion of the set of responses to the question about, you know, do you agree that is it your perception that Grand Valley is committed to diversity? Students who responded no. And so looking at their open-ended responses to, well, what did they think then? It may have been a relatively smaller portion of the response set. I mean, many more of them said, yeah, absolutely. But among the ones who said no, there was a identifiable level of cynicism. Yeah, Grand Valley is supposed to say it's committed to diversity, and so there's lots of diversity words out there, lots of rhetoric, but we don't actually see it happening, some of these people said. There were a good number of comments about there's 100 zillion organizations and activities, and there's all kinds of diversity activities for different cultural groups and ethnic groups and this and that. But the people who go to them, these students said, are the people who are part of those groups. And so, yeah, the opportunity's there, but do the rest of other students actually take advantage of it? And these students would say, no, we don't think they really do. I don't know, this was a number of years ago, so I'm running short on specific examples, but there is a sense that there is a difference between commitment to, or expressed commitment to, and something more like what this question is actually asking: how much does the institution encourage contact among students, and how successfully do they do it?
Sure, and that's definitely a limitation of this kind of survey data is, I mean, this question tells us, you know, people are saying very little or some or something like that, and that's kind of the depth of the information that you have. Certainly to the extent that we want to be able to answer questions of, well, what would it look like? What would the institution have to look like for you to say it is an institution that emphasizes this? That's something we would have to dig into further in focus groups or interviews or some richer form of data gathering, and certainly that's a possibility we can consider.
I was just going to make a comment about the classroom. So first, diversity, according to this survey, is not just racial and ethnic. So there's always diversity in the classroom, whether or not it's visible. So I'd say that's the first thing. But if a professor ever gets to the point where they really truly feel like their class is all the same somehow, there is opportunity for, I mean, I feel, I'm not a professor, but I feel like there's opportunity for, you know, projects and assignments to go outside of the classroom. The discussions and assignments and, you know, syllabus don't have to be all directly related to the students that are just in that room. There's a whole campus of students that they could be encouraged to talk with, interact with, and incorporate that back into their, you know, assignments and classroom. And same thing with encouraging for attending events, you know, where they might not otherwise have attended. I think that a professor, you know, we all have to recognize our privilege, and as a professor, somebody that's, you know, leading a classroom or even any faculty or staff member on campus, we have to kind of remember that as a leader for the students on campus, because they're not always going to be remembering or even know. So part of having the power of working on this campus, I think, is keeping that at the forefront of your mind and knowing when to bring that out for students to take advantage of.
I agree. Those both seem like great thoughts.
And there are really good examples. I've seen a couple here at GVSU, but good examples of, Suzanne, to your point, where someone like a mathematician, a math professor would say, there's no way I can talk about diversity in a math class or physics. And actually, there are best practice curriculum for all of those kinds of conversations. You can, even in a statistics class, if you're choosing topics that are discussing racial economic disparities as the topical discussion for whatever those statisticians do, are ways that you introduce diverse topics and social justice topics. I think a physics professor here is exploring a new book that's called Social Justice for or Physics for Social Justice, and how you incorporate that within some of the problem sets in terms of the topics as well as the kinds of data you can use. So I think those opportunities do exist, and we should maybe try to explore them more.
We've been talking about classrooms. We've been talking about classrooms not being diverse, certain upperclassmen. But I think we've got to examine why that is. Are students self-selecting? Are diverse students self-selecting, or are they being self-selected out? what are the roadblocks that our diverse students are seeing to get into some of these programs, and what are we doing to address those? You know, I know recently we noticed, Mike noticed that the STEM programs, we had less diverse students, so hence they wrote a grant, they got funding for STEM. So we need to, I think, instead of just saying some of the programs are not diverse, look into factors that are contributing to the lack of diversity and address them so that they can be. Because my experience is students are being selected out of programs. It is not that they're self-selecting to be not participate in certain academic programs.
Sure, and as difficult as it is to assess university climate at the university level, much of climate is local. It's microclimates as experienced by the individuals, and there's a danger that detail can get washed away in as you aggregate across groups. It's a delicate balance, but I agree that as we perceive these differences, we need to dig further and figure out where they come from.
And you're right about the climate data. When we asked the overall climate question, overall, it was positive, comfortable or very comfortable. Highest when you think university-wide, got lower when you got to a unit or department, lower when it was in the residence halls, and lower when it was in the classroom. So in that order. So it kept declining as in each of those micro spaces. So it's an interesting, you're exactly right in that comment.
So this is just a reflection about how, to the point of, is this meaningful, how even more meaningful but rather compelling I think this is. I think as a predominantly white institution, if we take seriously the mission of creating global citizens who can help solve wicked problems and connect with communities, you know, this idea that there's any space that could be absent an understanding of diverse perspectives, that we're going to have to be especially intentional as a PWI, because while I know we're headed in the right direction with changes in demographics, you know, I'm not sure that we, in our foreseeable future, ever think we won't be a PWI, although, you know, I'd be excited about that kind of potential. But I think that changes how we need to think about delivering this kind of education in particular. So, and I'm not thinking that's exclusively the classroom. I think it's the co-curricular and the curricular. But how do we, I mean, so if the delivery of that is essentially faculty and staff, there's a whole host of things that we need to do as students in terms of teaching them to be peers and community members, et cetera. But this, to me, is a really compelling case around faculty and staff.
I agree. And as I said, I have my opinions on these, and for the most part, it's my job to keep my opinions to myself. But I will point out that a part of our value of diversity, as this is a slide from Jesse, you know, explicitly relies on the value of the kinds of interactions that this NSSE scale purports to measure for all students. So all of our students gain in terms of, I'm sorry.
We're checking your email now. What's up there?
You don't want to see
Everyone close your eyes.
Sorry about that. I could have gone on for another 10 minutes waving at a slide that wasn't there. Our value for diversity hinges on an understanding that all students benefit from these types of interactions, both in terms of learning benefits and in terms of civic and employment benefits. If, you know, based on this premise, we can't really afford to wait for the demographics of our student body to catch up to where we would like to be. Certainly we want to push towards that goal, but I would argue that we owe it to our students to work out ahead of that at the same time in terms of these types of benefits.
I was just going to add, when and listening to some of the comments in the space about programming and in the classroom and so forth. And heavy on my mind right now is our upcoming program proposals for the teach-in that we have. So I was thinking that's an ideal, perhaps, platform of how do we ask maybe for different proposals. So maybe instead of ask, you know what I mean, like drawing in faculty like Jesse had identified from statistics, and how are they talking about social justice? How do we get diverse students to be at the front of that space and have a voice in those conversations, as well as our white students too, right? More privileged students. So I thought that would be an idea, and maybe moving a little bit away from information sharing with them, but more of a critical thinking aspect in that particular platform.
Philip, can I ask about the data? So from our selected peers, would any individual institution ever release their data like we do? And the reason I ask that, because if we can find a selected peer, which we're saying is comparable to us, could we look to them for some best practices or better practices or other practices? And can we also compare the diversity to see if the question that we started with actually does matter? Are they a much more diverse institution, or less, or similar, and are doing better than we are on some of these developmental kind of questions?
Yeah, and the answer is we absolutely can ask. And the worst that can happen is they can ignore us or tell us no, and we can move on to the next peer. NSSE, the NSSE organization itself would not do that for us. So we couldn't just say, oh, can we see the NSSE results for James Madison or whatever. But the people who, in my role, are typically pretty interested in seeing data put to use, and within bounds, are frequently pretty willing to help each other on a collegial basis. So we can ask. Sure. So I see now that it's about 1 o'clock, and I think we've exhausted the questions in the room. I do appreciate all of you coming and all of you participating. I think it was a helpful discussion, certainly only a start, but I think it was a useful start. So thank you, and thank you to Jesse and to Becky.